A new feature added to Numbers in version 11.2 was pivot tables. Pivot tables are a useful way to quickly summarize data in a table. So let's take as a first example here a table of sales. So we just have dates, we've got a product, and we have the amount of products sold. So looking at this, it's really hard to get an idea of which products have sold more, maybe which months were better, maybe which products had more individual sales versus the quantities and all of that. It's almost impossible to see that with our eyes, but a pivot table will shed some light on this. To create a pivot table, just select any cell in this table. So the table itself just has to be somehow selected. Then you can click this button here, Pivot Table. But this will create a pivot table on a new sheet, which means for this tutorial we'd have to be switching back and forth between sheets. So instead I'm going to go to Organize and create Pivot Table and then say on Current Sheet. So we can see the pivot table right next to the original table. And here we've got the pivot table. But there's nothing going on yet because we haven't told the pivot table which columns we're interested in here. If we look on the right under Organize, Pivot Options, we'll see that there are 3 columns here and none of them are checked. So let's go and select the amount. And when we do that, we'll get our first piece of information quickly summarized, which is the total amount of all sales. So this isn't that useful. It's just one dimension here and we could have easily used a sum to figure that out. In order for pivot tables to be useful, we need to add at least one more dimension. So let's do that with Product. I'll click on Product here. And now we can see the data summarized with each product and the sum of all of the sales for each of those. And then the grand total there at the bottom. So we can see here that orange has outsold everything else. And we can quickly see that without having to do a whole bunch of sum-if calculations. On the right here we can see we have these 2 checked. And then here at the bottom we have columns, rows, and values. And product was added as a row. And values are added as the values for those rows. So we have 3 rows and then the values calculated there are the sum. We could change that by clicking the I button here. And instead of sum we could do, say, average. Or we could do count, the number of times rows appear with that product. Or we could do something else, like for instance the base value could be % of grand total. So this is the count and then % of grand total. So 40% of these rows are oranges. But we could do the sum and see that, say, it's 24.68% of the sum of all of the products sold are apples. So there's a lot you can do by changing the values right here. Now let's add another dimension to this. I'm going to add date. And I'm going to see date across as columns. And you can see date is here in columns and product is rows. What would make more sense is if we switch them. Let's put product up here in columns and date down here in rows. So now we see dates going down, products across. Since there's only 3 products, this is a little easier for us to view. Notice it breaks the date by year and month. And we can change that by clicking here. And we could say group by year quarter or whole year or year week. All sorts of different options. Even day of the week. So now we have these grouped here. We can easily see some data that we could never tell just by looking at this. For instance, we can pick out a good month for individual products. Bananas sold really well in February, for instance. December was good for oranges. And so was June. We still get grand totals here, so we can see January, the total sales. We can easily pick out which months did particularly well for sales like that. And we have the totals for the products here at the bottom as well. So there's a ton of information right here. We could really quickly maybe make some decisions based on the data that we could never even see looking at the original table. Now note when you want to update something, if you update the data, you have to manually update this. Let me show you. In January, we've got a sale of oranges here, 49 oranges. So we can see oranges, January, and there's the total. So if I were to increase this by 100, we should see this number jump. But it's not going to. If we select the pivot table, there is a refresh button here. This prevents numbers from kind of freezing up if you have a massive table here and then you're just making a whole bunch of changes. And every time you make a change, it's got to update the table. But it also allows you to make some changes, look at this table, and then refresh and then see the changes applied. So you can see here that number changed to add that 100 that was added there, and all of the data added up here. The sums on the bottom and on the right and the grand total right there all took that into account, but only after we hit that refresh button. Let's look at another example. Here are some grades for some tests for students in a class. So we'll select inside this table here. We'll go to Organize and we'll create a pivot table. And we'll do it on the current sheet here. So now we have to decide what data we want summarized in the pivot table. So let's go and look at the scores here. That's the total for the scores. That's not really very useful. Let's go and change that to the average. So the average score for all students on all tests was that. Now let's go and add something else to it. This will be the row that we'll add. So let's do it by test. Now we can see all the tests here and we can see the average for all the tests. So we can pick out, this test and this test were particularly hard and this test was easy, or at least the students did better on it. And then we could go and look per student. And then we could see the students across here and we could see how the student did on each test. So instead of having this table here, which was a nice way to record each bit of information just kind of in a little database, we can now quickly jump and see how did this student do on this particular test. We can also see for a test what was the average. Remember, we changed the value here to average, not sum. So we could see that students did pretty well on this test, but students struggled on this test right here. And then we can look at the students themselves and see which students struggled, which students did particularly well. So we've got a ton of information right here. And it was important for us to figure out what information we wanted to see. For instance, we have date here, which we wanted to record the date that each test was given. But it really doesn't give us any useful information to put that in the pivot table. So we'll leave that out. So here's another table with some sales again. We've got dates, stores, the product, the amount sold, and the salesperson. So we could do a lot with this. Let's create a pivot table here. And we could figure a lot of things out. Let's go and set the primary thing, the value here, as the amount of sales. So we'll put that there and we see like the total. Let's now go and add some things. Instead of just checking them off, I'm going to actually drag them to rows. So let's go and do salesperson. There we can see the salesperson and their amounts total sold. And let's do store. And let's put store above salesperson. And then let's do product and then put that under salesperson. So we have store, salesperson, product. Now if we look at this table here, we get something that's kind of looks like it's one-dimensional. It's just a linear list. And we have the store, salesperson right there, the products under that, and then the total for each one, plus the total right here. So this is the Amy total. This is the total for the salesperson Amy for all products. Then we have the store central. We've got Mark and Mark's total, Pat and Pat's total, and all of that. We go down here, the store total is there. So we've got this list here that we can quickly see all of these totals. You can click here to kind of hide all this information. And then you can unhide it by unclicking it there. If you hold down the Option key and click, it will do it for everything there. So now I've compressed all of this and I only see the totals. So I can look here and see the totals for that. I can Option click here and just see stores. So now I have this great little kind of app here almost where I could say, okay, I want to look at the North Store here. The North Store sold the least. Let's take a look here at what we've got. Okay, which salespeople sold a lot, which salespeople didn't sell as much. And then we can dig down there and see what's going on for that individual salesperson. And then you could close that and go back in here and all of that. So this is another way to use pivot tables to dig down into your data to see what's happening with a large, this is a very large table here. It'll be hard to see what's going on, but by summarizing it in a pivot table that's just using rows, there's a lot that we can tell. So those are some ways to use pivot tables to visualize your data and do it without using any formulas at all.